If you want to affect a process, you have to know the process. I don't know how much time it'll be between your AI model is playing against somebody else's AI model.
So what is like for you the biggest difference between when things first started to now?
Starting out from scratch is hard. If you're not willing to give it 100%, stop and do something else.
So welcome everyone back to Verdusco Talks Business, the show where we're real business owners share how they get customers, grow revenue, build systems to scale. No motivation, no theory, just real execution. I'm your host, Raul Verdusco, and today we have a real special guest named Steve Ayer. He's the president of IGD Solutions, but honestly, just one of the pieces of who this guy is. Steve spent years deeply involved in FIRST Robotics, not just as a participant, but as a mentor, a judge advisor, and one of the people behind the scenes that make sure the next generation of engineers and innovators get the opportunity they deserve. And I wish I had someone like him when I was young. And if that wasn't enough, Steve also is one of the co-founders of SASA, the Student Association for STEM Advocacy. Today, we're going to talk to Steve on his journey. It really means to be a pioneer in the FIRST robotics community and where robotics and automation is heading. Steve, welcome to the show. As we're honored to have you here, really appreciate you joining us today.
Glad to be here.
So, Steve, tell me about, or I guess you say, tell the audience about a little bit about yourself, your background.
Sure. I started a company and the internet was going crazy back in 1999. We started out as a web content company and evolved into a software development company and have seen multiple shifts over the last 27 or so years. Into mobile wasn't even a thing when I started. Content management systems didn't exist. There was no AI, anything. And so the industry has shifted a number of different times. A lot has changed in that space, and I don't really like to sit still too much. And so I started getting a bunch of other things going on, both in the volunteer world and in other businesses as well, just to keep things exciting and keep my portfolio sort of diversified, so to speak, in what I was involved in. And so I started mentoring FIRST Robotics team, and their pitch was, "Hey, can you help us with our website?" And I said, "Sure, no problem." And showed up, met some awesome kids. The website was pretty easy at the time. Back in like the 2006-07 timeframe, pretty straightforward to build a website. And like I said, met these great kids. And one day I was hanging out, and there was a student working on an essay, and said, "Hey, want to help me with this?" I said, "Sure. What are you working on?" And he said, "Well, it's the Chairman's Award." And I said, "All right, like, what's the Chairman's Award?" And so he explained it's the highest award you can get in FIRST Robotic. He said it needs to be 10,000 characters. How many is it now? I think he said 15,000 characters or 15,500 characters, something like that. I said, "All right, when is it due?" And he said at midnight tonight. It was probably 4 or 5 o'clock at that point. I said, "All right, we can do this. Like, let me strap in here." And so I started helping this student edit this essay, and got to a point where I've learned there was a presentation that went with this, and so that was really my involvement that first year is helping with the website and doing some editing. And the team ended up winning the Chairman's Award at one of the events that they went to, and so I learned a little bit more about what it was and how it worked. And I started helping with their presentation and started connecting them with some business connections that I had with, the Chamber of Commerce and other folks in town, and helping them fundraise. And so I got in, pretty heavy, and learned what robotics was all about. And if you've never been to a robotics tournament, I would equate it with like the Nerd Olympics. There's crazy hair and kids dancing and nerds of all types, smart in all different areas. Every year they participate, grows and learns new things and comes along, and it's a great program. And so I started working more with the team, and I did about 10 years with the team until ultimately we won the World Championship Chairman's Award. And through that process, we were sitting in the audience one year, and they were talking about the winner of the Chairman's Award that year, how they had gone Washington, D.C. Well, one of the other hats I wear is a school board member, and I've done a lot of advocacy work as a school board member, both at the state level and federally. And so the announcement of, hey, this team has gone to Washington, they met with representatives. I said to my kids, I said, hey, you guys want to do that? I know how to do that. And so we brought a group of kids in 2009, I think, was the first time we went. And, I didn't think it was that exciting, but they seemed to enjoy it. We met with our representatives and senators and some folks working on some STEM lobby kinds of things, STEM education kinds of things. And they had a great time apparently, and they wanted to go back. And so we came back again. We started inviting some other teams to come along with us. And eventually that turned into a full blown conference in 2014. And so we started the National Advocacy Conference which I think we had 125 kids that first year. We have usually about 300 kids now. But that effort really turned into what is the Student Association for STEM Advocacy, which we officially started in 2020, which was the absolute perfect time in early 2020 to start an organization that runs in-person events. And so our first couple events were virtual by way of the pandemic. We have worked to continue to engage students in the advocacy piece and tried to get efforts going in every state capital around the country as well. And so we meet a lot of awesome volunteers and awesome kids in the process. And hopefully we're telling our elected officials why education is important, why STEM education is important. And that's a few minute overview for you.
Man, that's a boatload of information. You brought back so many memories, especially back in the day when, smartphones were smartphones now. You kind of remind me of my senior design project where it was like a home automation system. There was only like 2 or 3 companies at the time was doing it, where you could like monitor your lights and your heating and all that good stuff. And so we created that. And I remember grabbing my phone. I remember their presentation. I'm like, one day you're going to be able to do it from here. And I was full of crap at that time because I didn't know if it would actually ever happen, but obviously it has.
Yeah, it's amazing what especially with the advent of AI and just how fast that's moving, from even week to week. It seems like the canvas of what you could actually do just expands. And I think those folks that are embracing it and starting to get into it are going to have a significant advantage. If you're still paying somebody to manually compare things or, to move data from one system to another, I mean, those are like easy wins that you can, fairly easily automate
Yep.
today. And my company, we do a lot of work in the nonprofit space, and think, associations and, professional groups and, all those companies tend to have the same sorts of systems in place. There's some sort of membership management system. There might be an e-blast system that's separate. They might have a professional development or learning management system where they deliver classes and education. They might have a donation system to it, an event registration system, and they're all separate. And a lot of what my company does is help to try to tie some of these things together, and to avoid that manual, like moving data around. And, if you're paying somebody to import and export, babysit these things, it's probably ripe for some sort of, automated connection between them. And now with the advent of AI, I mean, it makes those kinds of things a lot easier. You throw a file and say, hey, format so I can import this into this other system. So even if you are manually doing it still, it's even easier than it used to be.
Oh, wow. Well, I was going to ask you about who you serve, but it sounds like more nonprofits, more, I guess you say smaller companies. Am I correct?
Yeah, we have kind of a full range of folks we deal with. So we have, a client that's like a Fortune 50 company that we provide a number of, development services to and a bunch of different, projects that they offer. And we have, the small mom and pop company down the street and kind of everything in between that nonprofit space or associations. That's kind of a niche of ours where we understand how to deal with boards and committees and how policy governance works And we have a number of different folks in a couple in the medical realm as well that do research on different data that they collect, and so building systems that help collect that data and crunch that data, manipulate that data, and spit it out to usually improve whatever it is that procedure is. That's a big part of what we do as well. But really, all over the board, kind of depends who has the vision for what they want to accomplish, and if we can provide a solution, for that.
Nice, nice. So I guess going back to first robotics again, you mentioned about helping a young buck with his essay. So do you feel you kind of stumbled into it, or didn't it become a passion, or just I guess how did that come about?
Yeah, as a school board member, I obviously enjoy working with kids and want to see kids be successful. I hope all school board members can say that. But that was a big driver for me being on the school board. And at the time, when I first got elected to the school board, I didn't have kids and I wasn't married. And I eventually got married and eventually had kids. And when they invited me to come check out their program, as a school board member, like, sure, I'm hadn't seen the robotics program yet. It was fairly new that it came on. Robotics was really young at that point. And so I went to go check it out. When they asked for help, I was like, absolutely. Like, this is definitely something I can help with. Kind of low hanging fruit, so to speak. And I jumped right in. And the number of amazing kids that I met over the 10 years that I was mentoring was just awesome. And then when we won the World Championship Chairman's Award, I worked myself out of a job, and I enjoyed robotics and the program so much. I thought so highly of it. That's when I really got into judging. And so I became a judge advisor, and I'm one of the lead judge advisors in the world right now that works on this stuff. And so I've been all over the place, internationally and all over the country doing different judging things. And so I would say it's fair to say I have a passion for it. I have kind of a systems mind at how I look at it. I'm fairly people focused. And so, judging isn't rocket science, but, in terms of standardizing a process and giving kids a good, consistent experience. And, at the end of the day, judging is about inspiring kids. It's not about, hey, how do I take points off for them not doing what they should be doing? Nope, it's not like that at all. It's like, hey, how do we recognize the best, in a certain category that's here? And how do we make everybody feel good about it? It's not like everybody gets a gold medal, in the process. There are certainly winners and teams that don't win, but it's really about talking to some of these kids. And as a judge, it's a lot less effort than mentoring. Mentoring was like at least one meeting a week, many times more, all year. Like, there wasn't an off season when we were doing award stuff. The robot build only happens certain time of year, but like the team and the awards and the outreach is a all year thing. And so that's where I was coming from. And judging, it was like, oh, you show up for 2 days and you're done. Being a judge advisor and overseeing all these judging activities, there's a little more work involved than that, but it is not nearly as intensive as all year, all the time. And one of the cool things about being a judge is you see a lot of the same kids year after year on these teams. And, when you see somebody in their freshman and you're like, all right, they're kind of quiet, you see them the next year and you're like, all right, they're talking a little more, they know a little more. By the time that student's a senior, in some cases, you're like, oh my God, like, how far this student has come and how amazing they are. It's like, can I buy stock in you? Is what I think sometimes, because they're gonna do whatever it is they want to do, and they're gonna be successful at it. And if I can be at all part of that success by encouraging them along, like, sign me up. I'm all for it.
Perfect, perfect. There's something I've been wanting to ask you for a long time. So, because I knew you started when first robotics first came out about till it is today. So, what is like for you the biggest difference between when things first started to now? Because like you said, AI's coming about and everything. So, what is like the biggest difference for you in your perspective?
I'm not an engineer. I don't know the on-field, fabrication and components. Like, I know about the software. I'm not a developer myself, and so my perspective is probably a little more high level. But like, when I got involved, it was like kids were actually driving the robot. Like vision systems weren't particularly a thing. And if they were, they're very limited in use and, not widespread at all. And now, like all of the best teams have vision systems. And yes, there's somebody behind the sticks driving the robot, but like they don't have to align the robot anymore because the robot's using, 3 or 4 cameras on the robot to find the April tags that are on the field and automatically align. And when it's aligned, it shoots or does whatever it needs to do based on that alignment. And obviously, there's defense involved in these games that these robots play. And, how you deal with that and how you code that. I don't know how much time it'll be between like, your AI model is playing against somebody else's AI model. Back, I don't know, 20 years ago, if you wanted to map out a trajectory of a ball and, set your spin rates and velocities and things, your motors and, I mean, you just do a chart. You pick a speed and okay, I'm going to measure where the ball went and I'm going to interpolate based on all these data points. Today, like these teams are using, AI to say, all right, this is what I'm trying to do. Here's a couple things like just build me a model and like let's adapt the model. Because if you're shooting and this past year happened to be shooting balls, they call fuel. And, it's like, all right, the first one comes out, it's going to slow things down. Like, how do you keep the RPMs up? It's like the advanced nature of how they're solving these problems is I don't know, it's getting easier. It's getting more complex, but the results are even more impressive that you have more and more teams doing the, vision tracking and path planning and, automating these things to the point where it's, very little room for operator error.
Yeah. You know what's funny? Well, 2 things you remind me of when you said that. So one, I don't know if everyone knows, but I helped judge in this state competition. They were talking about the spinning of the ball, and I don't know if you ever played tennis or ping pong. I never really knew about spinning the ball until I played ping pong, like table tennis. And this guy I used to work with, man, he could just spin it and hit the table and just fly off that way or fly off that way. And I'm like, how do you do that? And then I kind of got good at it. I could sort of spin the ball, put it that way.
You realize you were a ping pong shark. So,
No, no, I'm far from it. I mean, these other guys are really good. I just
yeah,
know
I
how
mean,
to spin a
well,
little bit.
the point holds, right? The way these kids are modeling the spin on the balls to make sure when they hit the target, they go where they want them to go. Like
Yes.
hardcore, right? You shooting the ball out, but you're also putting spin on it.
I was like, wow, because when he brought that up and I'm watching it, I'm like, "Well, okay, now I see what they mean. Because it would hit the plastic and go right down because of the way it spins. I'm like,
Mhm.
all right, yeah, these
Yeah,
kids are really
if
not
it
that
doesn't
game.
spin the right way, it pops right out.
Yep, yep, exactly. And then the second thing they kind of remind me because you're talking about how things evolve, especially with the cameras, with help with alignment. And it reminded me of this, a friend of mine, he was a transmission calibrator for automotive in that area. And because of I don't know if you're aware of this, but because of the cameras, the cameras so you can see when you back up, he goes, the kids he was trying to train, they were like, I can't parallel park. And these were test vehicles. So then none of the bells and whistles worked yet. And then he's like, "Why?" And he goes, "Because the camera doesn't work. I don't know how to parallel park." So so he's like, "What? You guys don't know how to parallel park without the camera?" So, yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
I hope,
Even, I mean, more along those lines, like, I mean, a lot of teams even have a camera just to be able to see because a lot of times there's field elements, in the way, so you're trying to pick up fuel or balls and you can't see it because the thing you need to shoot it in is in the way. So they use cameras much like a backup camera, that you would use to parallel park. They're using that to, get around obstacles and pick up fuel and, that kind of thing too. So, whatever innovative approaches they have, they're using them all.
well, I'm curious, obviously we're talking about robotics and automation. So where do you see that heading, first robotics for the next generation, the future, because of the way things are moving now?
Yeah, I think first had a partnership with Lego for many, many years, and this upcoming year is the final partnership. And, the Lego robotics really focuses more in elementary school. Younger kids, from, I don't know, I think it's 14 and under, can do Lego robotics. And usually it's, at least in Michigan, it's more like 10 and under, 11 or 12 and under that end up, doing those things. So I think that's a big question mark. What's next for that level? There's other programs out there as well. From our nonprofit standpoint, we work with First Robotics, but we also work with Vex Robotics, and the REC Foundation, which is another great program that gets kids engaged in robotics. We work with organizations like Project Lead the Way, with the idea that, like, hey, if we're all asking for the same thing from a STEM education standpoint, the more people that ask, the more likely it is to happen. And so I think, we're going to continue to, live in a knowledge economy, right? Like I don't know what is going to happen relative to manufacturing and, onshoring and those sorts of things. And I'm not an economics expert, but the economy right now is based on this concept of, knowledge and, what's going on between the ears. And I think AI is going to create some disruptions there. But, as it comes to robotics, I think whatever the new Lego piece is going to really matter because, that's where a lot of these kids start and they continue on through, middle school and junior high and get into high school and, stay involved. And the vast majority of them end up going into a STEM field, which I think is awesome. And I think a lot of it is how do we get more girls engaged in that process? Because, the STEM world is still a male dominated, arena. It's there's not a lot of minority representation in that arena. And so the more that we can engage folks to think, oh wow, this STEM thing is cool, not that, oh, it's hard and I don't want to do it. We want to dispel those, sorts of rumors and fallacies of like, oh, I can't do it, or my friend isn't doing it, so I'm not going to do it. And I think robotics helps with all of those kinds of things. But I think we're in for a pretty major disruption when it comes to, AI and what sorts of jobs we're going to need less of. If you're an analyst and you're comparing data, and there are, you and 9 counterparts, like over the next year and a half, like I don't know how you're going to need 10 people. You might need 2, and not 0, but I don't know that you're going to need the amount of folks that you've had. When it comes to things like payroll, oh, my whole job is, transferring numbers over and putting them in a spot and proofreading that, like, I mean, that's all going to get automated. I don't need 2 payroll people, or maybe it's not a full-time job anymore. And I think some companies are going to eliminate folks. And other companies are going to get way more productive because if I can take somebody who, maybe 10% of was 100% of their job and now it's 10% of their job, and I've got 90% of their time I can allocate to more value add sorts of growth opportunities within the company. I think that's going to be great. I think in this evolution, there's going to be the knowledge of how to use these things. When the calculator came out, if you didn't know how to use a calculator, it could have been, it's the greatest tool ever. Like you weren't useful with it. I'm not that there's a big learning curve, but that was revolutionary at a time. And so, now if you know how to use these AI tools, I think those are going to be really skills that are kind of leading edge. And I think communication skills, problem solving skills, that sense of grit and resilience, all those things are not going to be replaced by a machine anytime soon. Anything in the trades, I think is pretty safe for quite a while. I did see a robot. A friend of mine works at Boston Dynamics, and he was showing me a robot that was designed to basically lift things and move them. And it's like, okay, that's great if you're unloading a truck or something like that. So yes, we're gonna have some automations there, I think, in the next few years. But for now in the trades, having the skills needed to build and wire and construct and fabricate and plumb and HVAC and all these things, I mean, our AI systems are probably a ways away before they get to the point where like a robot's going to show up and be able to ask the right questions and diagnose what's going on with a complex system and figure out how to get access to that system. And, there's certain things that just industry experience give you. So I think we're in for a lot of disruption, but as these sort of leading edge, industry things are going on, I think they're going to trickle down to, high school robotics. And I think we're going to see more and more automations and, more and more strategic decisions and how these kids, do scouting. Is there a way for, all the matches are recorded? Is there a way for AI to just watch the matches instead of the kids sitting in the stand and watching the matches and taking notes and writing down how many balls each team scored? I mean, is that going to be automated? Are they going to learn how to do those kinds of systems? And those would be really valuable skills.
Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head because, at least for me when I was in college, obviously we were using the TI-89, and it was funny to me because I at least would try, or I at least knew how to do the math by hand.
Hmm.
Some of the guys that were in my class didn't really know how to do it by hand, or struggle with it, I should say. It's very important to at least know how to do it, even though you may utilize AI to help you through the process. You know, kind of change the subject on you. So your SAS program, how'd you come about it, and what's the mission on that side of it?
Sure, really. So the mission is pretty straightforward. We want to engage students in STEM advocacy. We want to train them up. We want to make them great advocates. The skills involved with advocacy are real world skills that you can be successful with, really, in any circumstance, any job, any place you find yourself. And those are things like being able to want something and figure out how to get it. And so the steps we preach are: number one, it's all about building a relationship. And typically we're going after elected officials, but I mean, the same is true whether that's a mentor that you have, whether it's a college professor that you're dealing with, whether it's a boss in a company. Build a relationship. You never know when you're going to need to leverage that relationship. So little legislation is actually moving right now due to hyper partisanship and a number of other factors. Because it's so polarized, when something does move, you need to have those relationships ready so you can reach out and say, hey, this is a good thing. Here's how it's going to help me. Or maybe it's not such a good thing for STEM education, and here's why, and here's some of the downsides. So number one, build a relationship. Number two, you want to make them a fan of what it is that you're doing on your robotics program. And so that's not terribly hard, right? I mean, you've been involved, you've seen it. It's easy to say, hey, this is cool stuff. And so these kids telling their stories, saying, hey, when I started, I was really lame and I had no friends and I couldn't talk to anybody. And I've been involved for a year, and now I have a ton of great folks that I can call my friends, and I know all these hard skills on engineering and math and how to use tools. And I have skills like communication and problem solving, and I've changed dramatically in a short amount of time. And here's what I want to do with my life as a result. I mean, that's powerful stuff. And so make them a fan. And then whatever it is the specific ask is, if there's a bill that's going to help promote STEM and STEM education or after school STEM engagement programs, like, yes, we want to ask for that. But, along those lines, we preach, if you want to affect a process, you have to know the process. You don't go to your senator to say, hey, I would like to have open campus when I'm a senior for lunch back at my high school. It's like the senator doesn't have anything to do with that. By the same token, you don't go to your school board and ask for tax credits for you know or college tuition if you go into a STEM field. It's like, okay, school board member doesn't have anything to do with tax policy in that regard. You've got to know who are the players involved, how does the process work. And so those are a couple of the things that we try to train kids up on. We really stay out of the politics of it. Everything we're asking for is very much bipartisan, very much common sense. A lot of times, what happens is the students get frustrated because they're asking for something like so simple and straightforward. And for some political reason, it doesn't happen. And that frustrates them. And if they're getting a little frustrated, they're probably learning how it really works. And when they talk to these senators and representatives kind of firsthand, and then you sort of see what's on the news and how it's, I'll say, distorted a little bit, because, right, when you're reporting on something, you're simplifying it because some of these processes are so complex. You've really got to boil it down to, end up in a headline or something. And so students usually kind of get under the hood a little bit and understand a little bit about what's going on there. And I think they engage in it. It gives me hope for the future that, with students engaging in these kind of things, that we're gonna be okay. It hasn't let me down yet. So that's really positive, as well as we do this advocacy business. And the sort of side effect of it all is the kids gain a tremendous amount of confidence quickly. If you can come in and you can talk to a senator, like anybody else is easier. So if you're going for a job interview, or you're interviewing for a scholarship or something, like that's a piece of cake after you've, made your case to a senator in their office with the intimidatingly large wooden doors and, the Capitol outside the senator's window. Some great real life skills that they learn. And to touch on, you asked kind of how it got started. We started this conference doing advocacy work with kids when I was volunteering on a team. And then as I left the team and started judging, we kept it going because there was demand for it. And at that point, it made sense to turn it into an official nonprofit because it had grown to the point where it was a little more than I wanted to sign for on my own. And we had issues of like, all right, if we make a few bucks one year, I have to pay tax on it because like that's how it works. And it was like, all right, we just want to keep that money and use it next year. Like, how do we do that? What's the right way to do that? And creating the nonprofit was the right way. And that's allowed us to get more people involved and, engaged and expand our advocacy, like I said, in the state capitals as well. And so we've got a great team. We're all volunteer run organization. We have a great team of folks, and like we usually have about 300 kids coming to Washington every summer, which is coming right up here in about a month. And we're going to train them up for a couple days, send them up to the Hill. They're going to meet with their elected officials, and hopefully we'll see some change.
Awesome. Man, wow. Thank you, Steve, because I know that wasn't around when I was in high school.
No, I think, and there isn't a lot of other ways out there for kids to get engaged in advocacy. We explained right up front, hey, this is not a political thing that we're engaging with here. It's like we're not picking winners and losers. I don't care what party they are. I don't particularly care what your personal views are on, conservative or liberal or, Republican or Democrat or anywhere in between. Like that's not particularly relevant to what we're working on here. What you're saying is, hey, we've got a great idea. We've got a great program. It works. I have personal stories that can explain how well it works. I have data that backs up I'm not the only one that's had that experience. All these other kids have had that experience too. And for us to be competitive, we need to be doing things like this. And typically where robotics exists is suburban America. The robotics we need more robotics and more STEM in really, really urban areas and really, really rural areas, and that's where we really need help. We need mentors in those places. We need sponsors. We need schools to have a way to get things started. And that's really what our advocacy revolves around is these robotic students are saying, we have access to this program and it works. We think everybody else should have access to this program as well. And like I said, it's whether it's first or not is not particularly important to me. It's like they need to have access to some sort of STEM engagement because that's what our future is going to be.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. So one last question on the subject. So what has been, I guess, your point of view, the most efficient way to get a young person involved in this area?
It's challenging because, how do we even communicate with young people? There's not like an e-blast list or, something. It's not like they're going to
You guys don't
conferences.
say TikTok videos?
Well, that's the direction we're headed, and that is helpful to have, TikTok and YouTube and, Instagram and, social posts is a way to get it. I think, the good old fashioned like talking to each other is huge. If students have been involved in our program and they go out and tell other students about it, and the team has been involved and they tell other teams, I mean, that's some of the best, sort of, I'll call it marketing that, we could have to spread the word. But still, there's huge segments that are like, oh, I didn't even know this was a thing. And it's so every year we do our best to try to see, hey, who's interested. And there are certainly teams that, all they want to do is build a robot. They want to do their 6 weeks of build and do their 2 competitions and call it a day. And like, that's totally fine. Those kids are probably learning a lot, having great experience, and that's awesome. For teams that are saying, hey, we really want to go out and we want to engage other people, we want to get more teams going, We want to help, really change things on a large scale. Like, that's where advocacy comes in, and that's where we can definitely make it as unintimidating as possible. We want to make it very accessible, easy, kind of I don't know if you call it a step by step, but a more formulaic approach to say, hey, let's build the relationship, make them a fan, let's hit them with the ask, and then realize we're going to settle in. It's not something where you're like, hey, we should do this. And they're like, okay. And it just happens. It's like, all right, we've got to build up a critical mass over a period of years, and eventually something good is going to happen. And that's the name of the game. And when you're on a team for maybe at most 4 years on a high school robotics team, that can be frustrating because sometimes it takes 6 or 7 or 8 or sometimes 10 years to get something, going. So that settle in piece is something like we're pretty upfront about, hey, you're not advocating necessarily for you. It's all these other kids that don't have access to this, and probably kids that are way younger, because by the time it gets through, they're going to have, grown up. For your peers, they're probably, on to whatever's after high school at that point, so it does take time.
It does. It does. Well, I got a couple last questions for you. So, one of them is, for a young person or a young inspiring entrepreneur trying to follow a path like yours, what is your best advice for them?
So when I started, I didn't really know what I was doing. I thought, hey, the internet's going crazy. We were getting paid by ad revenue, like money was coming in. We were building these online communities, and everything was great. The internet kind of flipped upside down, right, when the .com bust came along and all these companies went away. And I kind of saw that coming, like the amount of money we were making on ad revenue, like there's no way that was going to be sustainable. And so I knew that was coming, and so we had already really tried to shift. My point in sharing it was like starting out from scratch is hard, and if you're not willing to give it 100%, like stop and do something else. Like it's gonna take 100%, and if you have any more than 100%, like that's what it's gonna take to get something going. And when I started, people had said to me, "Oh, it takes 3 to 5 years to get a business up and running and profitable." And part of me was being young and naive and maybe a little cocky, where I thought it can't possibly take that long. We've got great ideas and great projections, and 27 years later, like I could tell you, like, yeah, there's a reason why people say that. Even at first, if you're making a few bucks, like you're just investing that back into the business and to grow and get it going. And so, as I've looked to do some other things in business, franchise is a place that I've looked to say, hey, rather than come up with my own system from scratch, how do I plug into an already proven system? So that's something I've dealt with as well. Depending on your particular circumstance and what kind of company it is, there's not really a reason to reinvent the wheel if you could buy into a system, that's out there that's already been proven. And so those are some things I would look at. I never wanted to be in business and have everything depend on me. I wanted to be able to, have a little bit more freedom and flexibility in my time. And not that I'm like ever not working, but, my kids are getting a little bit older now, but as they've been younger, it's like I want to be there to go to their award ceremony at school or their concert, in the evening or any of that. I want to be able to have flexibility and schedule to do those kinds of things, to work, when I wanted to work. And so I definitely put the time in, but having the flexibility to kind of arrange that time is really a key driver for me, as well in that process.
Yeah. And just to add to your point, one of the books I've read, Robert Kiyosaki, Rich Dad Poor Dad, obviously has been there for years. And he actually, I don't remember if it's that book or I read several of his books actually, but in one of them, I think it's that one. He talks about franchising, and if you're looking to, because there's a lot of things that people don't understand when you build a company from scratch. Like you got to do ad revenue, you got to do, you got to do the bookkeeping, you got to be able to do accounting, you got to be able to do marketing, sales, etc. And with something like franchising, you got a playbook's already there, and you probably got about 60 to 80% of it kind of done for you. And
Right.
you don't have to generate that stuff. It's all played out. And to your point, it makes it a lot easier for everyone.
Yeah. And I mean, you got to do due diligence, because like it might seem like it's figured out, but I mean, you have to sort of prove out that this system is proven out. and just because it works in Southern California doesn't gonna mean it's gonna work in upstate Michigan.
Yep. Exactly. Exactly. And one last question for you, Steve. So, if people want to learn more about you and get involved in First Robotics or SAS, how do they reach you?
Sure, there's a few different ways. So my name again is Steve Heyer. My company, that my day job, so to speak, is IGD Solutions, and you can go to igdsolutions.com. SASA is the website is www.mysasa.org, mysasa.org. If you have robotics questions, staff at mysasa.org. And if you have any other questions, my email address is sjh@igdsolutions.com. And happy to answer any questions or engage with anybody on any of the topics that we talked about here today.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you, Steve. That was man, a highly educated man. I learned so much in the 40 minutes we talked. Oh my gosh. Awesome, dude. No, appreciate everything you're doing. First Robotics, getting kids involved in advocacy. I just say thank you for doing that. That's awesome.
Thanks for having me on. It's always good to see you, and I'll see you in a blue shirt at an event judging next year.
Exactly. Thank you, everyone. Please like, subscribe. Thank you.